As we come up to the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, we have an opportunity to ask ourselves and our fellow citizens, what kind of country do we want to live in? And I think we all need to take part in that discussion, and I see this conversation as a critical part of that.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores a topic at the heart of public service: equity. From policy design to implementation, it's more than a buzzword. It's a guiding principle for how government can serve all communities fairly and effectively. But what does equity look like in practice? How do we measure it? And what barriers stand in the way? To help us unpack these questions, we're joined by two Academy Fellows and leading voices in the field, Kimberly Walton and Christopher Koliba. Kimberly Walton is a nationally recognized expert in equity-centered leadership and public administration, with an impressive career spanning more than 20 years as a senior executive in the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security and Commerce. Christopher Koliba is a professor of public administration and policy, whose research focuses on complex governance systems and the role of civic engagement in advancing equity, offering insights into how institutions can be more responsive and just. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Now, I usually start these questions off with the fundamentals. How do each of you define equity in the context of public administration, and why is it essential to the work of government? Kim, let's start with you.
It's a good definitional question to start with. So for me, equity in public administration, it means designing and delivering services in a way that ensures everyone, regardless of background, income, age, ability or disability or geography, can access the tools and opportunities they need to thrive. Unlike equality, which treats everyone the same, equity acknowledges barriers and works to remove them. So for government, this isn't about giving people more, it's about giving people what they need to fully participate in civic life.
And Chris, how do you think about this?
I totally endorse Kim's definition. I do as well see equity as a subcomponent of a larger equality umbrella. And equity implies equal outcomes. Equity then becomes one of the critical criteria that public administrators use to evaluate the efficacy of any public policy. It sits alongside of other pillars of our field like efficiency, security, liberty, and welfare. And so as we are facing troubling times to define it and censor its use, it's really hamstringing our ability to actually render effective policy analysis. And it's going to have some pretty profound ripple effects, I believe.
You mentioned troubled times. I'd be remiss not to mention the current administration's view towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the policies around this work, particularly in the federal government, but also schools and society more broadly. Chris, you've written about this recently. Why is equity in government and public administration important? What's been its history, and where do you think it goes from here?
I recently published an op-ed in PA Times talking about the censorship that's taking place in many states across the country and the self-censoring that's beginning to happen across the country as it relates to a focus on equity. And as an educator in this space, my colleagues across the country in certain states are being faced with censorship and prohibition against teaching any kind of topic as it relates to equity. And it certainly aligns with the Trump administration's recent executive orders in this space. Equity considerations of government are rooted in our democratic standards and principles. And public administration as a profession, as a set of practices, as a field of scholarship, has not turned a blind eye to the challenges that inclusion and equity face in liberal democracies like ours. We, I think, centered equity more clearly in our field beginning in the 1960s. Beginning with the Meadowbrook Conference, the new public administration ideals put forth by George Frederickson and others coming out of that conference, really placed social equity as a center of emphasizing the responsibilities to the needs of citizens rather than to the organizations. And so what it does in public administration has historically placed the center of focus on the needs of citizens and their diverse needs and their differentiated needs. And I'm very proud of the legacy that PA has played in extending the rights revolution, extending services to folks from all walks of life and levels of vulnerability. And again, that's what's at threat right now. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the implications of that soon.
Now, Kim, you've been working at the forefront of equity, and in fact, you lead an organization that helps leaders navigate the complexities of working across demographics and cultures and ensures that everyone can meet their full potential. Why would there be any question about its value? And are some of the criticisms around equity or diversity, equity, inclusion, are they fair?
That is a great question. So you're right. For many of us, the value feels intuitive. It's about fairness, it's about opportunity, and ensuring everyone can thrive. But history shows us that progress often invites resistance, especially when it challenges longstanding systems and assumptions about merit and identity. So some criticisms are coming from misunderstanding, like the idea that equity means unfair advantage. Other, I believe, reflect fear of loss, fear of change, fear of being blamed. And while not all the criticisms are fair, many deserve, I think, reflection, especially when they call for more transparency, balance, or discipline and accountability and implementation. I think that should be there. But equity isn't about redistributing exclusion. It's about removing the barriers that never should have been there in the first place. Somehow we need to come with a common definition, because I don't think we're all talking about the same things.
I mean, I think that's a good point. And when I hear you say that this deserves reflection, that makes me think, who would be the ones that are going to do that reflecting? You have people that would do that now, but you certainly have future generations that would need to think about this in that context as well. Chris, what is the risk to future generations of public administrators, and this country for that matter, if communities don't understand the definition and let alone the importance of equity, whether that's in academia, whether that's in government or society more broadly? What's your advice on how to do this work in the most inclusive, collaborative way that brings everyone together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think before answering that, I think we need to be taking a sober look at the existing and the shifting legal environment. And I'm no legal expert, but I have been digging deeply into some of the recent Supreme Court rulings. We're seeing a move towards a unitary executive doctrine that the Supreme Court is clearly giving more power over to the president. And the current president is choosing to exercise that power directly and specifically to purge the government and industry and nonprofits of what they deem as wokeness, which is bundled up into these concerns and considerations around equality and equity. Rulings such as the Dobbs decision overturning Roe, the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision that basically just bestowed rights of the business owners to discriminate against LGBTQ couples. And then more recently, the Students for Fair Admission decision that prohibited higher ed institutions from accounting for race in admissions, are all leading to what some fear or are concerned about is a new doctrine of anti-differentiation, which is doing away with a precedence that's really been established since the civil rights movement to really center ethics on addressing the needs of diverse populations. And so I believe the Supreme Court thinks that we're living in a post-racial society, and as much as all of us would love to see those ideals realized, there's a big gap between those ideals and reality. And so the challenges for public administrators of the day is to center that work through our research and data collection, through our work as citizens and collaborating with civil society. And in the narratives we tell, I think we need to focus some more attention on civics and the value of individual rights and human dignity in liberal democracies.
Chris, you just mentioned the impacts of the current administration and the efforts that they're taking. Kim, there are many reports around funding being withheld, redirected, and in some cases eliminated. Employee roles are changing and different organizational functions are being reassigned. Even language to describe an organization's commitment, their programming, and how they do things in general, all are changing in response to executive orders or even the perception of being misaligned with federal policies or this current administration. What's the effect of these policies and the organizations taking these actions? And do you think it will ultimately help recast our society in the best way?
So that last part of the question is a real tough one. But I'll say all of these actions, changing job roles, eliminating language, I think there's a symbolic impact and a practical one. So symbolically, they're signaling that fairness and belonging are optional values. And that can erode trust among the employees and the public. Practically, they're removing the infrastructure for addressing inequality. And the need doesn't disappear, just the capacity to meet it disappears. So will it help recast society in the best way? Not if we walk away from equity entirely. But this moment could mark a shift from buzzwords to embedded, resilient practices. The work is harder now, but it's also more meaningful. So I'm always hopeful about the future of public service and the young people who are going into it.
So we're talking a lot about the administration and their actions, but what's the responsibility of the public? And what should those who are advocates for this work be doing right now? And ultimately, what should the public administration community be doing?
First of all, civil society is organizing. People are not sitting on their hands. There's connections and networks that are being formulated that hadn't existed before. I'm seeing a resolve among the activist community. I think there's a renewed need to dust off those values and begin to organize around rights and around civil rights. You know, as Kimberly mentioned, and I just asserted too, that I think we're seeing a shift in the legal interpretations of the Equal Protection Clause, for example. That's going to have tremendous ripple effects. And so we need to document what is happening in real time to people. We need to resist efforts to scrub data, specific demographic data, and differentiating data along protected class lines of protected classes. We need to understand if public policies are being employed and directed and affecting people in different capacities. And then we need to uphold the values of an American democracy that suggests that we're all in this together, that we have some collective responsibilities for each other. We're only as great as a country as we are by the measures of the well-being of our most vulnerable. And so we need to really mount a serious and concerted effort to mount a social movement, a professional ethics movement, to reinstill and to protect the centering of human rights and dignity into the work we do.
Kim, you've led efforts in different federal agencies, specifically around embedding equity into day-to-day decision-making. What are some of the most effective strategies you've seen or that you've led? How does this show up in practice in government institutions?
What I would say is that treating it more as a design principle rather than as an initiative. So I've seen this work come alive when it's treated as not as an initiative, but as a design principle. So you're designing policy, you're designing programs, and you build it in from the beginning. You don't build it in from the beginning. You have a program, and then it's an amendment, it's an add-on, and you get resistance to the change in the add-on. I've had opportunities when I was in government to lead the privacy function. I had responsibility for making sure our policies and our programs and our technology were accessible. You build it in as a design feature. So some of the most effective strategies would include doing impact assessments before launching policies. You do an equity impact assessment. And the second is disaggregated data to identify disparities. I can't harp on that enough because you can put data together and look at it and say, oh, everything is fine. But it's when you disaggregate it is when you actually find the disparities. So it's about building equity into the decision-making muscle of the organization and not bolting it and forcing it on at the end. So if equity is a part of the process, it's not going to be a part of the outcome.
I really like this concept around design principle. Chris, you obviously have worked in academia, but you've also worked at different levels of government. What do you think are the unique challenges or opportunities of ensuring equity at the federal level versus the state and local levels?
It's a great question. Yeah, and I am a former school board member. I was elected to serve 2 terms and served as a chair for a period of time. And our public education system is one of those classic intergovernmental relationships that are being impacted by what's happening. And as a former school board member, we were charged with ensuring that all of our students in the district got a good education. And that includes those with special needs and challenges at home and whatnot. Our public education systems are built on the assumption that all children are provided with equal access to a solid education, and in part to ensure that they obtain some kind of semblance of an equal outcome, e.g. everyone should get a quality education. And to do so requires us to differentiate between groups of students based on income, race, and gender ability. And we need to understand where or if there are gaps in the educational opportunities and work to help the districts to overcome them. And unfortunately, the infrastructure that has been put into place for decades, particularly around our special education infrastructure that is bolstered by federal policies and funding through the Department of Education, are now threatened. And so this really shows you a real demonstrable impact that changes and shifts could be having on the education of our children, which is lies at the core of our democracy and our well-being. It's very serious. I think school boards across the country are going to have to grapple with this.
The importance of equity becomes clear when you start talking about specific populations and specific policy issue areas. Kim, how does taking a more inclusive approach ensure no community or groups that are disadvantaged are left behind, especially in complex policy areas like health, education, climate, or wealth creation?
So I always think of the saying, what you see depends on where you sit. And when you think the people closest to the problem are often closest to the solution, if you just let them in and listen. And so when I think about inclusive governance, it brings in the lived experiences, and that's essential for policy that works in the real world. When you think about climate and you think about flooding, if you're talking to the people closest to that problem, they know that their land is eroded. They know when flooding occurs. Bringing them in an inclusive way will lead to a better outcome. In health, if you think about it, without community input, language or transportation barriers can undermine access. And you're not going to know that unless you have a system that is inclusive and allows voices to be heard.
The Academy wants government to work well and work well for all, not to the exclusion of anyone or at the expense of any one group. Kim, this is going to be my last question to you. If you could implement one transformative change, whether in policy, practice, or mindset, to accelerate progress on moving our country collectively forward, what would it be and why?
So this summer, I'm an adjunct at Boston College, and I taught a class called Fostering Dignity and Belonging. I love teaching the class, and all of my students, said they love taking the class. And so I'll answer your question this way. I would embed the principles of what I call belonging-based leadership into every leadership development program across government. Not as an optional model, it would be a core expectation, right alongside financial stewardship and strategic planning. When leaders are taught to create an environment where people feel seen, respected, and valued, they naturally design systems and policies that are more responsive, more trusted, and more effective. Belonging isn't about making people feel comfortable. It's about ensuring that they have a voice, a stake, and a fair chance to contribute and thrive. So public institutions, to me, are at their best when the people they serve and the people who work within them feel like they truly belong.
Chris, as we've talked about, there are a lot of news reports about society being divided, about how to approach equity issues. Even saying the word equity or even the letters DEI can sometimes be controversial. My last question to you, what motivating advice do you have for current leaders and looking ahead, our young public administrators working in today's current environment?
So I would say we need a transformative mindset, and one that's rooted in the higher ideals of our nation's founding. I'd like for people to take active roles in their democracy, take time to educate themselves on the issues and consider the rights and needs of others as they cast their votes and formulate their opinions. I think I'd like to see that no one branch of government or person with unitary authority who is in a position to fan the flames of intolerance. I'd like to see a legal system that adheres to a doctrine that seeks to overcome systemic oppressions and acknowledge their existence and their nagging persistence, I'd say. And I'd like to have our politicians and citizens to commit to pursuing truth by rejecting organized lying. And I think this will take a massive civic education movement. And I think that public administrators are well positioned to do something about this. I'm inspired by many of our leading lights in history. And MLK, I'm paraphrasing, the arc of history bends towards justice. It's also a jagged line, and we're experiencing periods of contraction and stymieing progress in the areas of civil rights. And this is not the first time this has happened. And for our colleagues of color they've been living this reality for a very long time. So practically speaking, we need to assess our levels of risk and act accordingly. If you're feeling constrained in one space, you can act in others. And as we come up to the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, we have an opportunity to ask ourselves and our fellow citizens, what kind of country do we want to live in? And I think we all need to take part in that discussion. And I see this conversation as a critical part of that. Let's put our elbows to the grindstone here and get to work. And that's, I think, what many of us are trying to do.
Equity has to include everyone. It has to be defined in the broadest way. Government certainly has and will continue to play a major role in how we move forward, but so does the public. It is clear to me that equity is important, and it's something that we have to get right. We'll leave it there. My guests this week have been Kim Walton and Chris Koliba. Thanks to both of you for joining. Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and edited by Matt Hampton.